Story 1, 2 I can think of. First is the cloisters in New York City. I ended up there by accident and did not expect the unicorn tapestries. It was glorious. The light streaming through the windows in an empty corridor was transformative. Second is the Fragonard Musée du Parfum in Paris. I learned so much. It was fascinating and interactive, and the gift shop was amazing. Story 2. For me, it was the Willard Clock Museum. I never expected to be amazed by clocks. A good friend told me he visited the National Postal Museum in Washington, District of Columbia, as something of a joke and left thinking it was one of the best museums he had visited. Story 3. I think the Art Institute of Chicago is one of the best museums outside of Europe. Story 4. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and the September 11th Memorial and Museum in New York City are must-see museums. Story 5. The Natural History Museum in Manhattan is huge. I could spend days there and still need to return. I knew it was going to be awesome, but I was unprepared. They showed a Milky Way documentary in the planetarium that was absolutely incredible. Story 6. The Art Institute of Chicago was fabulous. Please do not visit Chicago without seeing it. Sometime during my visit, I lost my brand new jacket and did not realize it until we left. I filled out a lost and found form on their website, and after I got home, they notified me that they had found it and shipped it to me. Story 7. I visited the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, District of Columbia, in 2021. It was one of the few museums that still had available entry slots because capacity was restricted due to the coronavirus pandemic. I learned much that I had not been taught in school about how Native Americans were treated by the government, which the current administration is now attempting to sanitize. Story 8. We visited the Henry Ford Museum in Detroit. We bought a 2-part pass for the indoor exhibits in the village, but we never made it out of the indoor portion. The steam power exhibit was amazing. Story 9. The Museum of London is currently being extensively renovated. I visited its old location in the city walls and was blown away by how much I learned. I was also surprised by how impressive the Frontier Culture Museum in Virginia is. Part of that is that it is not a traditional museum but an open-air living history site. Story 10. Dali Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida. It took days afterward to really understand what I had seen. Story 11. I went to the Musical Instrument Museum in Phoenix with no expectations. It is the most mind-blowing and detailed museum I have ever visited. I recommend it to everyone. If you are a musician, it is an absolute must. It also has a beautiful theater with world-class acoustics. Story 12. I was surprised by the International Spy Museum in the District of Columbia. I was there almost 20 years ago and went on a whim with my kids. I think they have changed locations or perhaps expanded the entrance since then, because I remember entering a relatively small-looking building that turned out to be quite large and, if I recall correctly, had several levels. Story 13. Kennedy Space Center has so much to explore in a day. It is really cool and there are space rocks. Story 14. The National Portrait Gallery in the District of Columbia and the National Portrait Museum in London are both spectacular. You learn so much history without even trying. Story 15. In the United Kingdom, we recently visited the Royal Armouries Museum in Leeds. It was astonishing. The purpose-built 5-story building is filled with all sorts of armor and weaponry, from Roman and medieval pieces to present-day and even futuristic fictional weapons. For example, a pulse rifle from the movie Aliens. We thought we would only spend an hour or two, but we stayed for several hours and I am still not sure whether we saw everything. Admission was free. Story 16. The Museum of Pop in Seattle. I have never found another museum quite like it. It was one of the many reasons I wanted to move to Seattle, a city that celebrates indie games, cool music, and film. The museum has a permanent exhibit where you can play indie games, a stage for local bands to perform, and several soundproof rooms to jam with strangers on instruments. I have seen 1 or 2 of these features in other museums, but not all of them alongside other collections unique to Seattle. Victoria and Albert East in London. I stumbled upon it during opening weekend while I was in the area. It is a great concept. Visitors can enter the warehouse and wander around on the scaffolding. It is similar to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York or Loose in Washington, D.C., but it feels more grand than simply looking into rooms with glass cases. You can get up close to centuries-old art and artifacts that are not behind glass. It feels like you are looking into someone's closet. Maybe that is not too far-fetched given how Great Britain acquired many objects. Story 17. The Bata Shoe Museum in Toronto is amazing, depending on the current special exhibits. Learning history through shoes is awesome. Story 18. The Hall of Gems and Minerals at the Houston Museum of Natural Science is unbelievably beautiful. Story 19. The Strong National Museum of Play was more interesting than expected. Story 20. Tate Modern. It's as close to a rock concert as a museum can get. Wild collection and, if you're lucky, great special exhibitions. Story 21. We visited the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia because we thought we should. We left for lunch after a few hours, then returned for a couple more hours. The entire conflict is laid out in great detail, material I should perhaps have learned in school, but better late than never. Fascinating. Story 22. The Oklahoma City Bombing Museum. I was stuck in Oklahoma City and had a rideshare driver drop me off to kill time. I have never in my life visited a museum that took me through an experience quite like this. They start with a calm introduction to Oklahoma City, then you enter a room where you listen to a court hearing that ends with the bomb exploding. This is the actual recording. The next rooms feel chaotic. Then the tour covers rescue efforts, the grief of those who were lost, and the manhunt for the perpetrators. It was so powerful. I am crying just remembering it. I definitely recommend it to everyone. Story 23. Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. The Phillips Collection in Washington, District of Columbia. Louisiana Museum of Modern Art outside Copenhagen. Museo Soralla in Madrid. Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond. Museum of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Story 24. Musée d'Orsay in Paris. I had very little interest in art at the time, but when I entered the museum I was fascinated by everything around me. I now have a replica of my favorite painting that I saw hanging there. Story 25. My wife and I visited the Buffalo Bill Museum in Cody, Wyoming. We had an hour to kill and laughed when the staff told us our tickets were good for 2 days. The joke was on us. We spent 4 hours that day and returned the next day. Story 26. We went to the Mob Museum in Las Vegas shortly after it opened. We had planned on an hour or two, but we were there for at least 4 hours. Another highlight for us was the American Visionary Art Museum in Baltimore. It had many fascinating exhibits. We had a great guide who was a Navy veteran at the United States Shipslater in Albany. It is the only World War II destroyer escort remaining, and we learned so much. Story 27. Carnegie Museum of Natural History holds a special place in my heart. Story 28. The City Museum in St. Louis was an incredible experience. My family still talks about it. Story 29. The Hermitage in St. Petersburg is impressive and enormous. I knew it would be grand, but we only saw a fraction of it in a day. The museum has many other items in storage that may never be seen by the public. The scale is awe-inspiring. So much luxury and priceless art. Story 30. The Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art is a seriously cool museum even if you are not the biggest fan of modern art. Story 31. The Titan Missile Museum is essentially a fully functioning nuclear missile silo with all equipment preserved. It has been decommissioned and is no longer operational. The tour lets you see everything. I highly recommend visiting if you are ever in Arizona. Story 32. The Deutsches Apotheke Museum in Heidelberg is a small museum in the castle. It presents the history of pharmacies and was charming. Story 33. The Bishop Museum in Honolulu was far more interesting than I expected. It is what I imagine when I think of a museum not modern and sleek. It looks as if it came straight out of the mid-19th century, and I love that. Story 34. The National Atomic Testing Museum in Las Vegas was fantastic. I highly recommend it. 10 out of 10. Story 35. The German Technical Museum in Munich has 7 floors of interesting exhibits. Story 36. I have two favorites. The Imperial War Museum in London is absolutely fantastic if you are a World War I and World War II buff. Tanks, planes, weaponry, armor, uniforms, and original documents, they have it all. The other is the La Brea Tar Pits in Los Angeles. The sheer number of fossils of extinct Ice Age animals there is astonishing. Story 37. The World War I Museum in Kansas City was incredible. I went in with no expectations and was blown away. Story 38. The Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures, West Asia and North Africa at the University of Chicago. Story 39. The Vintage Fire Museum, Jeffersonville, Indiana. As a former firefighter, this was especially meaningful to me. Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center at Washington Dulles International Airport, especially the antique section. The Ringling Art Museum in Sarasota. The Art Institute of Chicago. I got to see American Gothic up close. It was nothing like the photographs I had seen. It seemed alive. Story 40. I visited the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. One of the more interesting sights was the number of visitors wearing Make America Great Again hats that day. Story 41. As someone who is not a baseball fan, the Hall of Fame was fascinating. Learning the sport's history was interesting. Story 42. Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, and the Fenimore in Cooperstown, New York. Story 43. 4 children ages 4 to 11. The Noah's Ark exhibit at the Skirball is really cool. Story 44. The Prisoner of War Museum at Changi in Singapore is small but very well done. Story 45. We visited the tiny opera house in Mantua, Italy, Teatro Bibbiena. What a perfectly beautiful building. The crowning glory was the piano on stage, played by Mozart in 1770. Story 46. The Frye Museum in Seattle, Washington, is a free museum that houses both classic and contemporary art. Story 47. I visited the Maritime Museum in Genoa on a rainy day on a whim. It was actually pretty cool. The final section features holograms on one of the ships, allowing visitors to experience what life aboard probably felt like. Story 48. The Poster House in New York City. Story 49. The Vatican Museum. I knew the Sistine Chapel was there, but there was so much more than I expected. The number of sculptures took my breath away. Many of the famous works my art history professor showed slides of in class were there, and you could stand fairly close to them. They were not behind glass like Michelangelo's Pieta in the Vatican. One gallery had cases of historical items such as a World War II chaplain's kit. The gallery also displayed gifts to the popes from foreign heads of state. For some reason, there were a lot of gifts from Richard Nixon, the 37th President of the United States, who resigned rather than be impeached. Story 50. Visit the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. Watch The Art of the Steal, which documents how his art collection ended up in the hands of the people Barnes had wanted to prevent from controlling it. Either way, the collection is fantastic. Story 51. The Mini Time Museum of Miniatures here in Tucson is a lot of fun. You might think it is just dollhouse fairy stuff, but you would be very wrong. Story 52. Lang Pioneer Village has the Fife Cabin, named for the Fife family and red Fife wheat. The interpreters discussed the impact red Fife wheat had on indigenous peoples. I expected a talk about the history of wheat and bread in Canada and a celebration of wheat, but they also addressed the politics and the negative impacts. Story 53. Dia Beacon is an excellent museum with incredible large-scale works by renowned artists. If you are visiting New York City, take the Metro-North Railroad to Beacon for a day to enjoy the museum and the town. Story 54. Sir John Soane's Museum in London is an architect's house filled with the objects he collected, and every room is fascinating. Story 55. The Norman Rockwell Museum in Western Massachusetts is far larger than necessary. It was a pleasant surprise. They also had an excellent Mad magazine exhibit, so the whole visit was very memorable. Story 56. The National Postal Museum in Washington, District of Columbia, is off the beaten path and often overlooked. It offers a fascinating look into a complex system. The first postal route ran through the woods from New York to Boston, marked by cuttings on the trees. Story 57. The Sign Museum in Cincinnati was an amazing place I did not know I needed. My wife and I stopped at Carillon Historical Park in Dayton intending to stay for an hour, but we spent the whole day there and did not realize how much there was to see. Story 58. National Cowboy Museum. I was at a conference in Oklahoma City that allowed free admission, so I figured why not? It was awesome. Tons of great material on life in the Old West. I am a sucker for elaborate dioramas and life-sized recreations, and they had some excellent examples. A huge collection of remarkable saddles. And I am not a saddle person, but the collection felt like art in a medium I had never considered. There were many neat, quirky items I did not know I needed to see, like a Gucci Bowie knife given to John Wayne while he was working on a spaghetti western. What clinched it for me was the treatment of Native Americans. I expected either little discussion or a cliched, insensitive portrayal, given the museum's cowboy focus. Instead, it was nuanced, thoughtful, and informative. At the start of the exhibit was a large map showing each tribe and its original territory, and the overriding theme was that there is no single Native American identity. Native peoples are extremely diverse in language, customs, lifestyle, and religion, and the only uniting fact is that they lived here before Europeans arrived. I thought it was well done. Because I went for free, I cannot say whether a paid visit is worth it, but it was a pleasant surprise. Story 59. Muhammad Ali Museum in Louisville. I knew about his boxing career, but his life was so much more. I was very moved by my visit. Story 60. Actually good. The Bata Shoe Museum in Toronto. I was supposed to go there in high school, but a blizzard stopped our bus on the way. I have seen some exhibits on television and online, and they are pretty neat modern art in some ways. Cheesy fun. The Hollywood Wax Museum in Niagara Falls, Ontario. I have an entire album of pictures of the celebrities featured. Half the figures do not look like who they should, and the ones that do are often in outdated displays. For example, one display shows John Travolta and Halle Berry in the movie Swordfish. Some figures are inconsistently made, like the figures of Barack and Michelle Obama that seem to be plaster painted with a shiny clear coat, or the Jack Black figure that is just a pair of feet sticking out of a hippo's mouth. The best figure is not inside the museum. It is behind a viewing window outside, and it is Heath Ledger's Joker. They have since added a Jack Nicholson Joker to the display. The Simpsons display looks less like The Simpsons and more like an evil alien version of the family. My favorite figure is Bela Lugosi's Dracula, but only because he looks more like Emo Phillips in a cape. It all sounds terrible, but I still love going through it. Story 61. The Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford and the Hunterian Museum in London. Story 62. The Abraham Lincoln Museum in Fort Wayne, Indiana was privately owned, large, and impressive. Now it is gone. Story 63. We visited the visitor center and exhibits at Het Smashed in Buffalo Jump in Alberta. My wife and I were driving past when we saw the sign, and we both had the same reaction. We had no idea what it was and had to find out immediately. It is a fascinating exhibit about how central the buffalo was in the lives of the Plains people. Story 64. The Ancient Ozarks Natural History Museum is near Branson. It is part of Big Cedar, and I believe the owner of Bass Pro Shops funded it. We went in not expecting much, and there are so many artifacts. Native American artifacts, items from early settlers, Civil War relics, and, most interesting to me, skeletons of prehistoric animals such as giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and short-faced bears. It is much larger than expected. Story 65. The Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City is absolutely amazing. Story 66. The Legacy Sites Museum in Montgomery, Alabama offers a top-tier museum experience with much to see and absorb. Story 67. The Mining Heritage Museum in Silverton, Colorado blew me away, especially for such a small town. Story 68. Museo Nacional de Antropología in Mexico City. Incredible place. Story 69. The Museum of the Wild Turkey at the Wild Turkey Federation in Edgefield, South Carolina, is a top-tier museum focused on a niche subject. Story 70. I was in Atlanta and had just gone to the disappointing world of Coca-Cola. I should have known. Bored, I decided to check out the aquarium. At over $50 to enter, I was shocked, but after seeing the excellent exhibits, including whale sharks, it was worth it. It was a great time. Story 71. Each time I have visited the Guggenheim, I have seen something amazing. Story 72. The Mammoth Site Museum in Hot Springs, South Dakota is a huge mammoth pit that is being excavated. They built the museum over the site, and excavation is still ongoing, so you can walk around the catwalk and watch. It is really worth the stop if you are in the Black Hills or Mount Rushmore area. The North Dakota State History Museum is better than expected. It is located right across from the Capitol and is worth a brief stop if you are driving across North Dakota. It has the typical dinosaur exhibits and more, and admission is free. Story 73. I expected the Museum of European Solidarity in Gdansk, Poland to be good. It was much better than I expected. I have a strong personal connection to it. Story 74. The Airborne Museum in Saint-Mère-Église, France is excellent. It is probably the best museum I have ever visited. The World War I and World War II section of the Musée de l'Armée in Paris is also excellent. Story 75. The Peggy Guggenheim Collection in Venice and the Horta Museum in Brussels were both incredible. Story 76. The Anne Frank House in Amsterdam was an incredibly moving experience that made me cry. Story 77. The Holocaust Museum in Richmond, Virginia, was free to enter and presented a great deal of information. The exhibits covered more than just the camps, which I appreciated. Story 78. It might not be the best museum ever, but it was strikingly honest. The Australian War Memorial in Canberra was not all boastful claims of being number one. It also displayed failures. I appreciated the service at the end of the day. Story 79. The National Military Vehicles Museum in Du Bois, Wyoming, is amazing. Story 80. Alcatraz East Crime Museum is in the middle of Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, and looks like any other very touristy place, but it has a few notable exhibits, including Jeffrey Dahmer's prison glasses, John Wayne Gacy's clown suits, one of Ted Bundy's Volkswagen Beetles, and the white Bronco from the O.J. Simpson chase. Story 81. The Getty Villa was incredible. I had no idea what I was walking into, and it was surreal. Story 82. The Cody Museum in Wyoming is amazing. The Boeing Museum in Seattle is impressive. Story 83. The Natural History Museum in Gainesville, Florida. I am probably naming it incorrectly. The place was beautiful. Story 84. The Surgeons Hall Museum in Edinburgh was absolutely fascinating. I managed to visit every floor in 45 minutes before it closed. I would love to go back and browse at a leisurely pace instead of rushing through. Story 85. Once I visited the Audrain Auto Museum in Newport, Rhode Island, because it is near me and had an exhibition on the racers of Monaco. Despite the museum's modest size, it had an impressive collection. For example, it included a Bugatti Type 37, a Maserati 250F, a Lancia Delta S4, and my personal favorite, the McLaren MP4-4 driven by Alain Prost. The museum is also in a beautiful location. Story 86. I went to the Corning Museum of Glass expecting to spend 3 or 4 hours, but I ended up there all day. It was absolutely fabulous. Story 87. The Vasa Museum in Stockholm houses an entire 1600s ship that sank on its maiden voyage, was raised in the 1960s, and is displayed on land in its own museum. Story 88. My top 2 favorites. 1. American Visionary Art Museum, Baltimore, Maryland, in the Fells Point neighborhood. 2. Philadelphia Museum of Art, Benjamin Franklin Parkway, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The American Visionary Art Museum has amazing exhibits that always delight visitors. One I will always remember was an incredible display of outsider art. It featured truly wonderful works made by people with no formal training. The Philadelphia Museum of Art has a fabulous permanent collection that ranges from Marcel Duchamp to Renoir. There are always fantastic special exhibitions, such as the last one I saw, a collection of Van Gogh portraits. They were shown in the United States before going permanently to the Rijksmuseum. I recommend both of these great museums to anyone who happens to be in either city. Story 89. The Aviation Museum at Robins Air Force Base, Georgia, has some very cool airplanes and it's free. Story 90. The Polish Museum of America is low-key and outstanding. It is probably the most unassuming and interesting museum I have ever visited. Story 91. The Buffalo Bill Center of the West in Cody, Wyoming really impressed me. We spent much more time there than I had anticipated. It is very well done. We do not have children, but I feel that anyone who does should make an effort to take them there. It feels like required viewing for Americans. The Birmingham Civil Rights Institute was similarly powerful. I have not been to other civil rights museums, so I cannot compare, but my visit there was deeply thought-provoking and well-curated. I will also add the Wolfsonian in Miami. It has powerful displays of Art Deco propaganda art. Story 92. The Flint Institute of Arts is an embarrassment of riches. Given common perceptions of the city, people might be surprised to learn that it is the second-largest museum in Michigan, and its vast collection on display is stunning. Story 93. The Kyoto Railway Museum was amazing. I am not a train person, but I enjoy mechanical things, and there was so much to see and interact with. Story 94. The Penis Museum in Reykjavik is notable because it contains many penises. The New York Transit Museum is also noteworthy. Story 95. The Heinz Museum in Pittsburgh is not just about ketchup. It is named after Senator Heinz and highlights the history and culture of Western Pennsylvania. The sports section is fun and interactive, and you can see the original sets from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. The Center for Puppetry Arts in Atlanta is worth a visit, preferably paired with one of their puppet shows. They offer productions for children, families, and adults, and even without a show it is enjoyable. It is a smaller museum with an extensive Jim Henson section where you can learn about his career and see puppets such as Big Bird, Bert, and Ernie, the crystal sliders he made for commercials, and puppets from the Dark Crystal. There is also a puppets from around the world area that showcases traditional puppets from many cultures as well as well-known pop culture puppets. They currently have Salem from Sabrina the Teenage Witch on display and a section for traveling exhibits. Story 96. People really do not give the Smithsonian museums the credit they are truly due. I know they are top of mind for many people, but I think they are often disregarded as being for children or discredited because they are free and have been around for a long time. Let me tell you, they are all excellent. Each one is world-class. That quality extends to other institutions in the district as well, such as the lesser-visited National Portrait Gallery, the National Museum of the American Indian, the Washington National Cathedral, the National Zoo, and my personal favorite, the United States Botanic Garden. Washington, District of Columbia, is a jewel of a city. I hope it survives. Story 97. The Titanic Museum in the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada, was unexpectedly amazing. It has a fascinating collection of artifacts and recreations, thoughtfully arranged. Your ticket to enter is a reproduction of the actual tickets given to Titanic passengers. Each ticket bears the name and story of a real passenger who was aboard the ship. At the end of the exhibit, there is a wall of names showing who survived and who died, and you can learn the fate of the passenger on your ticket. That detail makes the experience feel more personal. The museum also houses the largest piece of the ship ever recovered, which is impressive to see in person. Story 98. I have to add a couple more. The museums in Ueno Park in Tokyo, Japan. The Art History Museum and the Natural History Museum were amazing. They are both massive and house many incredible artifacts and specimens, including Hachiko, the famous cicada. Story 99. Mattress Factory Museum, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I was expecting old mattresses. Story 100. The Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, tells the story of the African-American experience from the 1600s to today. As an older white man, it caused me to re-examine the history I learned in school and to realize how fucked up people can be to others. Story 101. I can't believe nobody has mentioned the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston yet. I scrolled to the bottom to be sure. It is unlike any other museum and absolutely wonderful. A wealthy eccentric donated it to the city upon her death with the stipulation that nothing may ever be changed. It was the site of the largest art heist in history, which remains unsolved today. The indoor garden is breathtaking, and the art collection is marvelous. Story 102. The Recreational Vehicle and Manufactured Housing Museum and Hall of Fame features motorhomes dating back to the late 1800s. Visitors can go inside many vintage recreational vehicles. Story 103. National Museum of the Air Force. I was not expecting it to be anywhere near that big. Story 104. It is no longer open to the general public, but I loved the Helene Time and Glass Museum in Evanston, Illinois. The museum housed an eclectic collection of clocks and stained glass. Although small and visited on a whim, it was remarkable. Story 105. Kohler Museum in Kohler, Wisconsin. It was fun to walk through the different product and design rooms. The wall of colorful toilets was a hoot. Story 106. The Cosmosphere in Hutchinson, Kansas was fantastic. It is a Smithsonian affiliate in the middle of nowhere, and we spent practically the whole day there. There were many great exhibits, and I would go back anytime. Story 107. The World War II American Experience Museum in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, United States, is a must-see for anyone interested in World War II history from the American perspective. The museum has artifacts from the home front and the military. It even has Admiral Yamato's battle flag that flew on his ship. It is a highly underrated museum. Story 108. The Truck Museum at Iowa 80. The truck stop is more of a novelty to say you have done it, but the museum is a short walk across the parking lot. Admission is free and donations are accepted. The museum is very interesting, with many examples showing how trucks have changed and evolved over the years. It even displays the tow truck used in the film Fried Green Tomatoes. Story 109. I visited a pleasant, free art museum by myself. Security guards kept a constant watch on me, which kind of killed the mood. Felt like a sign of the times, I guess. Story 110. There is a dinosaur museum in central Queensland, Australia, that looks like a dusty shed from the outside. Inside, it has impressive dinosaur exhibits because the area is known for dinosaur fossils. I cannot remember the name of the place because I was a teenager when I visited. Story 111. The Edo Tokyo Museum. I was dragged there and ended up enjoying it, especially the 20th century design exhibits such as cool cars and other items. It is in a very large, impressive modern building. Unfortunately, it is closed for renovations right now. Story 112. The Getty contextualized otherwise boring portraits because these were essentially the Instagram posts of their day and had a purpose that museums often overlook. The audio tour, which included other artists discussing what the paintings meant to them, really changed how I saw them. Story 113. The National Leprechaun Museum in Dublin, Ireland was nothing like my husband and I expected. It was a blast, and I am glad I found it by chance. Story 114. The Prohibition Museum is in Savannah, Georgia. There is nothing like a museum with a speakeasy that requires a password. Story 115. The Elsing Museum at Oral Roberts University houses an excellent collection of rocks and minerals with reasonably accurate information about them. It is notable that the museum is part of a young Earth creationist university. Story 116. The Glore Psychiatric Museum in St. Joseph, Missouri is an extensive museum that documents the history of psychiatric treatment in state hospitals. It is housed in one of the original buildings of a Missouri state hospital. Story 117. I visited the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I thought it would be 3 floors of pop art, but it turns out he was also a filmmaker. I was pleasantly surprised at 17 when my parents coerced me to fulfill my 15-year-old sister's request. Story 118. The Arabia Steamboat Museum in Kansas City, Missouri, preserves artifacts from the Arabia, which sank in the Missouri River in 1856. The river changed course and the steamboat was buried under tons of earth. A salvage team, investors, and the landowners worked together to dig it out with the idea of selling the recovered cargo, but they later decided the whole project would make a great museum. The variety and quality of the finds are impressive, and the story of how the team learned to preserve and restore them is equally interesting. Story 119. The Museum of Nuclear Science in Albuquerque has so much knowledge. Story 120. The Evergreen Aviation Museum in McMinnville, Oregon, is comparable to major air and space museums. It houses the Hughes spruce goose and much more. Story 121. The Deutsches Museum in Munich is one of the best museums I have ever visited. I had a bum leg but walked all day. Story 122. The Museum of the Great Patriotic War in Moscow, also known as the World War II Museum, is elegant, tasteful, very impressive, and sobering. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.